Greetings and bienvenue. Thank you for choosing this broadcast. Once again, tonight's tale features a soldier who is having trouble with his neighbor. I present to you the Barracks.
Alright, sure. First off, I got to let you know, I don't expect you guys to believe me. Hell, I barely believe me, and part of me wants to dismiss it as being a result of all the drugs and alcohol I was in at the time, but given that it was specific to that location, and the fact that I have a scar to prove it, and frankly, how real it all felt, I don't really buy that. So I guess really this is just me getting it off my chest. Back in 2011 I was in the Fort Campbell Army Base Warrior Transition Unit after being medevaced from Afghanistan. For those that care to know, I got exploded and it fucked up my back, hip, and knees. Anyway, the barracks they stuck is in were gods know how old, but they'd been holding injured, crazy, dying, and suicidal soldiers for a very long time. Shit like that tends to collect bad junior, I've learned. And I've been to quite a few transient places, hospitals, homeless shelters, mental facilities, for depression, in case anyone's thinking I'm just schizophrenic, to know that vibe. This place, however, it felt, angry seems too cheesy. It felt like something was about to happen, like the calm before the storm. That guttural feeling you get when you're a kid with a bad report card about to be opened. Anyway, one night, a couple of weeks in this place, I heard someone in the next room making banging noises and moaning gibberish at like 3 in the morning. This continued for the next 2 days, sometimes I even thought there were scraping noises against my wall, until my squad leader asked me if I'd been sleeping alright, wondering if my pain meds weren't working. I told him about the sounds next door, thinking this was someone really passionate about their masturbation and whatnot. He talks to me the next day, saying he'd looked into it, and there was no one living next door to me. Surmising that it might have been echoing from upstairs. So, I look into it. The floor above me was this guy named Bashing. Real quiet type, into computers and trip-hop, slept all the time. I kind of doubted he was the source of the noise, but I asked anyway. He pointed out that as a matter of fact he'd been up at 3 a.m., but he was lying in bed listening to his earphones. His roommate was still in the hospital too, so he got ruled out. I tried his neighbor as well for safe measure, but he said he was knocked out, and he was in for stomach problems, so it was unlikely he was having PTSD-related night terrors. So I leave it be, and that night, I hear the noise again. This time, I get pissed, and even though I know the next room is empty, I knock hard against the wall. I was actually surprised when it stopped. For a moment. Next there was no banging, no moans, only that scraping sound in intervals. I told myself it could be rats in the walls or some shit, but that wouldn't account for the banging and moaning. I almost laughed. I was freaked out, yeah, but I thought spooky moaning sounds had to be the most cliché style of haunting there had to be. The next day, I had staff duty, which meant I was working the front desk all day, but also meant I had access to all the room keys. So I waited for some dumbass to lock themselves out of their rooms, then taking advantage and sneaking a peek at the room next door. Only it turns out that it didn't lock at all. The inside of the room was clean, empty, no scratch marks on the wall, nothing suspicious at all except the feeling of being watched, which I figured was just related to last night's incident. So I went for a smoke to calm my nerves, and asked what it meant that a door didn't lock. The guy on staff duty told me it was a room they used for people on suicide watch. Well shit, I thought, so this was phone. Of course, this was just the start. Later on that day, I rationalized it was probably someone who knew the room was open and was sneaking in to bang his girlfriend or some shit. I considered checking it out next time the banging started, but frankly, both possible results of either finding some otherworldly shit going down, it watching some guy bump literal uglies with some stripper from Clarksville were equally unappealing. There was no need, however, there were no loud sounds coming from the other room for about a week. Then I spent all day drinking water for a urine test, and spent the rest of my evening pissing clear liquid. I thought I was done until I woke up at like 3 a.m. needing to piss real bad. That's when I heard it. The banging and the moans had stopped, but that scraping noise was sounding closer. And this could have been my imagination, but I could swear I could see fingers prodding out of my wall for an instant. I ended up saying fuck this noise and sleeping in the bathtub that night. The next day, I went back into the room to change. Everything looked the same except dimmer, somehow. I figured it was because I'd just woken up, but it stayed like this the rest of the day. Needless to say, I was spending less and less time in my room. That weekend I got absolutely wasted, and ended up passing out in my bed. I awoke the next morning with my cell phone in hand, a new text open with the words "It's coming" typed in. I just had to burst into laughter at how corny it was. Part of me swore it was just drunk me fucking with hungover me, which is something I would do, actually. The next day I hooked up with this girl and we fucked, only to have her scream out, "I shit you not, it's coming." I was certain I'd misheard and she'd said but I was bursting into laughter anyway, much to her confusion. I explained the situation after, and it turned out she was big into the supernatural and psychic stuff. No surprise, I did meet her at a hookah bar. So of course she suggested a Ouija board, but I refused, saying this shit was already cliché enough as is. She then suggested I ask to switch rooms, which was reasonable, but I guess partially due to stubbornness and laziness, I kept putting it off. A couple of nights later I woke up to what I could have sworn was a grab of my shoulder, stood up, and in the darkness, on the floor I could see what looked like the outline of a million fat, giant black worms, actually, shape-wise I'd say they were more like leeches, writhing on the floor. It wasn't quite even a physical shape, more like I could see the shadows of their invisible bodies. At which point I went nope.jpg and cocooned myself in a fetal position inside my blanket, certain I was hallucinating, only to eventually pass out. The next morning I woke up to find a wormless floor, and figured it was just a really vivid dream, only to find what looked like "It's here" scrawled into my little weatherproof notebook, as if I'd written it with my left hand. After downing a keg and suffering from a concussion. Basically, it was almost eligible, which was a perfect opportunity for me to dismiss it as being able to be anything. So I go on later in the day to take a shower after PT, in the little bathroom right next to the kitchen and bedroom. These were really small barracks rooms, only to have my horrible rendition of the Red Hot Chili Peppers Under the Bridges interrupted by the sound of someone moving around in the kitchen area. I pause and yell out, "Who's there?" with no reply. I never hear a door open or close, which is odd because if it had been staff, they sure weren't mindful about making all sorts of other noise. So there I am, naked, steam coming off me, I like my showers hot, carrying the towel holder pole as if it would do something, only to find the room empty. I relax, putting the pole down, only to feel like something was breezing behind me. I swear I think I broke some sort of record for changing into clothes and bolting out the room that day. So I talked to my squad leader about switching rooms, claiming I still can't sleep due to the noise, and asked for an appointment with a social worker because reasons. I decide to go to my room only to grab essentials and bolt, accidentally leaving stuff in my friends' rooms to avoid trips. Social work was no help. They suggested it might be brought on by insomnia, but that still didn't explain a lot of the details, nor the fact that it was directly connected to that room. I went back into it, packing my stuff little by little for whenever there was a room available, but I'm guessing whatever was in there decided it was tired of subtleties. One day, as I was about to leave the room after packing, I felt a spout of vertigo, that quick feeling of the room spinning. Only to find the shit I'd packed strewn across the floor. This happened several times as I tried getting through the door, only to eventually give up and stay in, skipping dinner. The next morning I ended up calling and coaxing my friend into meeting him in my room for breakfast. He called me to ask where I was after he'd knocked on my door several times and no one answered. I managed to get to the open door and meet him in the hallway, at least, but spent most of that morning trying to coax him into coming over. Someone had to see what was going on. I couldn't do this alone, but I couldn't tell anyone either. My depression was getting to me as well. I had started cutting myself. Nothing too deep. I guess just as a way of making sure I was awake. Luckily no one noticed, or rather unluckily, because at this point, I'd rather be institutionalized. Shit was getting weirder. I leaned against the wall at one point, only to feel it wriggling underneath me. I'd talk to myself, simple stuff like, did I leave this in my pocket, and hear a reply in my head that wasn't my own. Things would randomly be out of place, thin yellow slime trails would appear to be sweating out of random spots on the wall, I'd occasionally feel random touches with nobody there, and, weirdest of all, I think, random little dried up frog corpses would appear seemingly out of nowhere. Finally, my squad leader came through, almost a month later, saying I had 2 days to move to the next room and clean this one up. So after leaving the place spotless and frog corpse free, it was my last nightingale that room. Everything was packed and ready to go, and I was absolutely exhausted. I decided to lay down in full uniform because fuck it, and dozed off. Without fail, 3 a.m., I had to take a piss. So I go to the bathroom, and as I'm about to walk back into the room, I see it. The thing had an adult-sized head, and a small, disproportionate torso. It had long, greasy, black hair, and its entire skin looked like that of a burn victim's. Its limbs looked boneless and coiled around like tentacles with fingers at the end. What passed for its head were just 3 large, gaping holes with what looked like giant black worms wriggling inside it. Those holes gaped wider as it released an inhuman scream. Then I realized part of that screaming was me, and I bolted out of the room. I stayed up the rest of the night, smoking outside without talking. For some reason the idea that this was a Hispanic woman came into my head, although that thing looked like it had never been human. The next day I moved to a separate room upstairs, which was stupid, given that I was in crutches, and remember thinking, man, maybe I should have taken Chloe up on that Ouija board, and feeling real bad for it for some reason. A week later I woke up in the middle of the night, only to hear that sound again. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Luckily, however, for days later we did a mass move to the newly finished barracks a few streets down, and those old ones became MP barracks. And hey, you know, fuck MPs. They could have that shit. I did ask around, however, and people did claim to see weird shit in those barracks every now and then, but at least my story there was done. Also, I sort of regret not taking pictures, but honestly there was nothing to take pictures of other than tiny little frog carcasses. And that's just weird, yo. Also, when you're that fucking terrified, surprisingly your mind doesn't usually think, gee, this sure would make for a great Kodak moment.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.